Well, I'm being joined right now by Professor Will Waldorf from the Department of Politics and International Affairs. He's also a senior fellow at Defense Priorities. Many thanks, Professor Waldorf, for speaking to Times Now. Let me begin, sir, by something that you'd written a few weeks ago. And this is about how Trump can evade the possibility of getting into a forever war. And I'm quoting this for the benefit of our viewers. You said it's not too late to avoid such a scenario. Trump has already accomplished much in this new war by destroying most of Iran's navy, reducing its ballistic missile capabilities, and further damaging its nuclear facilities. Though those gains have come at a great human and economic toll, now it's time for Trump to take these wins and try to broker a ceasefire. Now, this was written on the 13th of March. We're speaking now on the 8th of March. Do you believe the situation still stands as it was about 3 weeks back?
Well, I mean, honestly, about 3 weeks back, I think he probably had a better foundation to sort of make the claims that he's had some victories here and that he can leave. At the same time, I think the president has, if he can get the Strait of Hormuz open, right, which is apparently what the Iranians agreed to, then it seems to me that becomes another victory, even though it was something that we had before the war, and even though
Yes.
Iran may still tax some of that oil, I do believe that is something that he will try to claim or could claim as a victory and probably be able to walk away, in addition to those other things that you mentioned that I had written about before, and say that he can at least claim there's a victory. Now, that will be politically contested. Many will have questions about
Yes.
that. But I think the president is looking for an off-ramp, and I think it's realistic to think that that he will at least try to still claim a victory around those things and could do so.
So that's something that he's already claiming, and so is the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, in the press conference that he held a short while ago. But Professor Waldorf, do you actually see that as a victory? Because the Iranians would also be claiming victory. They said that as far as the Straits of Hormuz are concerned, well, it's status quo ante, because the Straits of Hormuz will open up as they had been before the 28th of February, when America as well as Israel began their coordinated strikes. If the American and Israeli ambitions were ultimately to effect some kind of a regime change in Iran, and if that was their estimation of what a victory would be, haven't they clearly fallen short?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is yes, they've fallen short to some extent. I think they had very ambitious and very unrealistic goals going into this war.
Right.
And so it's no surprise that they've fallen short. I think they essentially believed that they could use limited military means, air power alone, these sorts of things to bring this about. That was all very unrealistic. I think the president was probably enamored with the Venezuela model here, where we took out the Maduro regime in just a matter of hours and thought the same would happen. So there were a lot of unrealistic assessments going in. And, you know, if you look at the goals of the war, certainly it's hard to sort of count it as a victory, even though the president and even though the Secretary of Defense may be saying that it is a victory. So yeah, I would definitely say that. I mean, again, come back to the Straits of Hormuz. Those were free and fair shipping lanes, you know, wide open before the war began, and now there's a very good chance that Iran will control them and also be exacting attacks. That is not an advancement in a sense for global interests. Now, having said that, I do think there are ways in which that tax may be less impactful on sort of global energy prices and those things than most of us anticipate.
Sure.
But and so I actually do think the president is right to step back from this war, as I've argued many times over in many different places. But to claim it's an actual victory is a real stretch.
What happens to the 57,000 American troops that are currently in different parts of the Middle East? Now, this is typically about 14 to 15,000 more than America would usually have. Of course, they have multiple bases in different parts of the Persian Gulf. But there's been a massive marine buildup of soldiers heading into, of course, this particular conflict, and ever since this conflict also began. What happens to those troops now? And do you expect the ceasefire to hold? And do you see the possibility of some kind of ground intervention in the event that it does not?
So again, it's very difficult to tell where the ceasefire is going to go itself. Let me start there. And in large measure because the two sides have very conflicting terms. I think it's an optimistic sign that the president said yesterday that the 10-point terms established by the Iranians are a starting point or a sound place to start for negotiations. That is a capitulation of sorts from where the president was at the beginning of the week. At the beginning of the week. So I think that's sort of a positive indication, but they still are miles apart in terms of where they are. At the same time, if we get 2 weeks out from right now, and this is an optimistic sign for why I think the ceasefire could hold and should hold and could expand. I think the president's going to be in the exact same position that he is strategically and politically as he is right now. He's going to recognize that, hey, to restart this war is going to be, again, terribly costly. And if oil prices and gas prices start to come down, and then Americans are asked to turn around and start paying for more of a war, I don't think that that's going to be very popular. So I think that this could create some momentum towards an agreement that could be very positive in the long term. But again, it's a very sort of tricky ceasefire. So coming to your point about troops and an invasion. Again, I think that is something that the American public is not in for. I think that is something that Donald Trump is not in for. I think he's been looking for an off-ramp for at least the last 2 weeks. And so for that reason, I don't think that there will be an invasion. But at the same time, if the president keeps using all of this same kind of hyper rhetoric about using military force, you can get caught in that rhetoric easily. So let's hope that he sort of steps back from that in significant ways, and perhaps over the long term starts to rethink U.S. Middle East policy in ways that could actually lead to the pivot of some of those troops out of the region, certainly, if not a significant number of them.
Let me also, for the benefit of our viewers, read something else that you've written, and it's very interesting indeed. You had written some time back saying that Trump, like other American presidents before him, has fallen into what I call the trap of asymmetric resolve. In short, this occurs when a stronger power with less determination to fight starts a military conflict with a far weaker state that has near boundless determination to prevail. Victory for the strong becomes tough, even close to impossible. So is that exactly what's happened as far as this conflict with Iran is concerned? That's point number one. Question number two. Would Iran have had the capability to withstand further American assault in the event that this ceasefire had not been called by both sides?
So I think on the first question, yes, I think the president is very much stuck in the trap of asymmetric resolve. I think that trap essentially remains in place, so to speak. I don't think it goes away with the ceasefire. As a matter of fact, I think the ceasefire, as I sort of alluded to a second ago, may accelerate a decline of U.S. resolve in particular, because Americans are going to be even less in for restarting the conflict in 2 weeks if the ceasefire should collapse. So I do think that the Iranians, again, on their side, have a fight to the death mentality. And I think we've seen that with their response. The regime knows that its survival is on the line here. This is different than the 12-day war where the United States and Israel did very targeted bombing around the nuclear sites. This was a war that from the very beginning threatened the Iranian regime. That's what President Trump said in that first night when he came out and announced the start of the war. So I think from the beginning what you've seen is that the Iranians have gone all in, and I think they would continue to do that. They have much more resolve to fight this war than the United States does. So that's the answer to your first question. Your second question, would the Iranians have been able to withstand that sort of onslaught of attacks? I will say this. I don't think that they would have capitulated. I don't think the regime would have caved. I think probably what would have happened, or what could have happened more likely, is that if all of those energy infrastructure, all that stuff had been destroyed, I think there's a very good chance that the regime might have literally just fallen apart, and we would have seen the collapse into a failed state in Iran, where it essentially would have looked to some extent like Gaza. That's what the Trump administration was indicating in terms of the destruction there. I think you might have seen some kind of a failed state emerge if the Iranian regime didn't hold on. And in my view, that would be as disastrous for global energy issues, for the nuclear issue, and for anything else as the regime staying in power, quite frankly, because I think that would have had all sorts of negative implications. So again, good thing that the president has stepped back here.
A couple of questions more. Do you sense a serious dissonance in terms of the priorities of both Israel as well as the United States? Because this was a direct negotiation or back-channel negotiations involving President Trump, maybe a couple of other players, and of course his Iranian counterparts. But Israel has of course welcomed the ceasefire deal, but has said that hostilities in Lebanon are not covered within the rubric of this 10-point agreement. So there is a clear divergence there. Where do you see all this heading in terms of the priorities between these two countries who wage coordinated strikes on Iran?
Well, I actually think that the Israelis might be painting this in more positive terms than they actually would normally hear, mainly to sort of keep President Trump happy. I don't think the Israelis like this deal at all. I think the Israeli posture on this has, from the very beginning, been regime change. And I think if they had their way, they would have liked to have seen U.S. boots on the ground, so to take down the regime. So I do think that there's a lot of disparity there. I think they've recognized the fact that President Trump has wanted to pull out and end the war for about 2 weeks now, that he has less resolve than they do, certainly. So I do think that there's a divergence of opinion there. And I think Lebanon's going to be an issue, in particular, when we move into the ceasefire negotiations here, right? Because the Iranians are saying the bombing in Lebanon needs, and the attacks in Lebanon need to end. The Israelis are going to continue that. It's going to be very interesting to see how the president plays that. Now, President Trump has a history of being able, it's there, right, of putting his foot down and telling the Israelis what to do, and even threatening to some extent create some distance in the relationship, which I think is generally and would be healthy, as I've written in other places. But so I think there's a possibility that he could push Israel to come in line. But the Lebanon issue is going to probably surface as a major sticking point in the negotiations going forward.
And a final question to you, Professor Waldorf. This is all, of course, happening also in the build-up to the midterm elections to be held in November. Do you believe that there's a lot of pushback within the US administration and, of course, the Democrat opposition that you see in the United States against any further escalation following, of course, we'll have to, of course, wait and see as to how the ceasefire holds. But in the event that either side ends up reaching a situation where they feel that perhaps a ceasefire may not hold, do you believe that the American public will really support any escalation from the American front in this conflict?
I do not. I think that this is a huge hurdle, and I think the midterm elections loom over this entire war in really quite critical ways. I mean, we know from internal reports that, some of the president's domestic advisors have been telling him this, right? Like, this is a disaster for the midterms and that sort of thing. Yeah. So I do not think that the U.S. public would stand by escalating the war again, going back to the conflict. So again, I think this is, again, a major incentive for the president to continue down the path of negotiations, or it should be at least. I can tell you that Democrats are making hay about this in significant ways, and they will continue to do so, especially on the affordability issue, which has been a critical issue that the president has not addressed effectively, that he talked about in his State of the Union and right before starting this war. When you have gas prices going above $4 and $5 a gallon here in the United States, that's not trending at all in the right direction when it comes to affordability.
Finally, before I let you go, even if the ceasefire holds, do you believe that he's managed to sell the narrative to his own support lobby in the United States, including the MAGA lobby, that he scored a victory here, or are they skeptical?
That's a really good question. I think for the rank and file MAGA voters, they will fall in line and see this as a victory. I think they almost will see just about anything that President Trump does as a victory. I know that they're claiming victory today. That again, that's that rank and file members of the coalition. If the war restarts or continues to drag on, is there a possibility that that rank and file may turn against the president? Yes, I think that's happened. I think we've actually seen some slippage in the poll numbers among MAGA voters as the war has gone on. What's the interesting dynamic here is at the top of the MAGA movement with what we might call the MAGA elites, or those that are the mouthpieces, the Tucker Carlsons, the Megyn Kellys and whatnot, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, who've been very critical of the president. Yes. I do think that there's definitely some splintering there.
All right, we'll wait and see as to how things unfold. In the meantime, thank you so much, Professor Waldorf, for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.